The morning of my wedding day began like any other, quiet and soft, the kind of stillness that belongs to early New York mornings before the city remembers itself. The light was gold and shy, slipping through the half-open curtains and spilling across the wooden floor of my small blue house on Maple Street. It was my favorite kind of light, the kind that made everything feel cleaner, as though the world had just forgiven itself. I remember the smell of brewed coffee still lingering from the night before, and the half-written vows lying beside my bed. I thought it was going to be the happiest morning of my life. But happiness has a strange way of changing its mind. When I stepped out of bed, my foot touched something rough. I looked down and saw a blackened curl of fabric, fragile and broken like the edge of burned paper. My heart went still. The hem of my wedding dress, white lace, weeks of hand-stitched hope, was scorched. The gown lay across the floor in silence, the way something dead might rest after surrender. The faint smell of smoke still lingered, sharp enough to sting my throat. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then I saw the letter. It sat on my desk, folded neatly beside my makeup mirror. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant and even, the sort of penmanship she'd once been proud of. My fingers trembled as I opened it. There were only 10 words, but they might as well have been fire themselves. We are against this marriage. No marriage will take place. That was all. No explanation, no apology, just a verdict. I sank down on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall where sunlight brushed across the old wallpaper. My parents had left for Italy before dawn. I knew because their bedroom door was open and empty, the closet half bare. It wasn't a trip for joy. It was an escape. Europe felt suddenly very far away, and America, my home, felt like a locked room. For years, I had believed my parents and I were a team. My mother, graceful but controlling, and my father, kind but always echoing her choices. We had weathered everything together, his long work hours, her illnesses, my college years paid with borrowed money and quiet sacrifices. But now I saw it differently. Maybe they had never really trusted my choices. Maybe they had been waiting for one big reason to walk away.
My phone rang.
It was Eric. "I'm 2 blocks away," he said, his voice calm and gentle. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my voice. "Okay," I whispered. He didn't know. He didn't know about the dress, the letter, the betrayal sitting in ashes at my feet. And he didn't know that no one else did either. I had kept our love a secret from everyone. Our town loved gossip more than bread, and I wanted something that belonged only to us. When I met him on the porch, he smiled in that patient way of his. Eric Morgan, with his brown hair always just slightly untidy, and his hands that looked built for both work and kindness. His eyes were the kind that listened even when his mouth didn't move. He was the son of Helena and Robert Morgan, owners of a multinational company in Boston, with offices scattered from Chicago to London. I had met them only twice, both times brief but warm. They were elegant, self-made people, confident without being cruel. But I never mentioned who they were to anyone. I wanted to be loved for myself, not for the shadow of someone's fortune. Eric looked at me then, his eyes falling on the singed edge of my gown. "What happened?" I swallowed hard. "Just a candle." I lied, too quickly. My hands were shaking, and he noticed. He didn't press. That was one of the things I loved about him, his ability to hold space without demanding the whole truth right away. "We'll fix it," he said simply. "We'll figure it out." We sat on the porch steps side by side, the morning air cool and quiet around us. He took out his notebook, the one we'd been using to plan our wedding. Inside were our budgets, our scribbled hopes, our promises written in numbers and ink. Between my savings, which was $4,300 tucked away in a shoebox and $1,200 in my checking account, plus the promise of help from his parents to cover the hall, music, and cake, we had just enough. Love and $5,500 felt like all we needed. When he left to pick up the flowers, I stayed sitting on the wooden steps. The porch had been built by my father's hands 20 years ago. Every board had been sanded by his patience, every nail hammered by his pride. I ran my palm over the railing, rough and familiar. Old but steady, I murmured. Then I laughed quietly, because that's what I'd been calling myself lately. Old dreams, steady heart. I went back inside, folded the letter, and placed it in a drawer. But the words would not stay folded. They burned at the back of my mind. I tried to make coffee and couldn't taste it. I tried to practice my vows, but the sound of my own voice broke halfway through. The silence in the house was enormous. By noon, Sarah arrived, my best friend since college, the kind of woman who always carried light with her. She took one look at my face and didn't need to ask. "Tell me," she said softly. When I showed her the dress, she didn't gasp. She just sighed, rolled up her sleeves, and said, "Well, we'll fix it." We worked for hours, patching the lace, hiding the worst of the burns. She hummed while she sewed, filling the air with something that almost sounded like hope. I kept thinking of my mother's letter and wondering what fear had driven her to write it. Was it pride? Control? Or was it something else? Fear of losing me to a world she didn't understand? As the afternoon light faded, the house began to feel smaller. The wedding that morning had felt like a promise. Now it felt like a battlefield. Still, Sarah wouldn't let me give up. "You'll walk down that aisle," she said, eyes fierce. "Even if you do it barefoot and with a singed hem, you'll do it." When she left, the quiet came back like a wave. I walked room to room, looking at everything my parents had built. The photographs on the mantel, the teacups lined on the kitchen shelf, the old wall clock that had been slow for years, but never stopped completely. I realized then that sometimes love and control were the same face, and it takes a long time to tell them apart. Night fell over the city. Outside, the world went on. Cars, lights, people who didn't know that a burned dress could change the course of a life. I went to my desk, took out a clean page, and wrote my vows again. I wrote them in simple words because truth, when it's real, doesn't need decoration. "I choose to love," I wrote, "even when it costs me comfort. I choose truth, even when it is small. I choose us, even when it is loud outside." When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it beside the repaired gown. I didn't know what would happen in the morning, or whether my parents would ever forgive me, or whether I could forgive them. But I knew this. The fire had already happened. The worst of it was done. What came next would be built, not burned. I turned off the lights and went to bed, the faint smell of smoke still in the air. A reminder that some beginnings start only after something has been turned to ash. By noon, the house felt too large for one woman and one burned dress. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was thick, the kind that hums in the corners and presses against the walls. Every clock ticked louder than usual. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a question. I made coffee just to have a sound in the kitchen, something living, something that hissed and sighed and reminded me I still existed. But even the smell of it, dark, warm, bitter, felt lonely in the air. I didn't know what to do next, so I did what I always do when I don't know. I called Sarah. She's the sort of friend who never needs full explanations. When she picked up, I barely got out. "Can you come over?" before she said, "I'm on my way." 15 minutes later, she walked through the front door with lemon cake and a sewing kit, wearing that bright red scarf she always said made her look less responsible. She saw the dress lying on the table and didn't even blink. "Jessica," she said, setting the cake down. "Breathe." We laid the dress across the dining table. The lace looked like a burned map, as if someone had tried to erase the route to something beautiful and failed halfway through. Sarah threaded a needle and got to work, and I followed her lead, even though my fingers trembled every time I touched the fabric. "You can't unburn lace," she said softly, "but you can sew courage into it." She smiled at me, that half grin that always felt like sunlight sneaking through clouds. We worked quietly, the rhythm of needle and thread making its own kind of peace. For a moment, I imagined my parents walking back through the front door, apologizing, saying it was a mistake. But no car came up the drive, no letter arrived with an apology, no phone call rang out across the silence. They were in Italy, Europe, the place my mother had always romanticized but never actually visited until the day she decided to run away from my wedding. By early afternoon, word had started spreading through our small neighborhood. Maple Street is a kind of place where secrets have short legs. I saw Mrs. Gordon from across the road slow her walk to a crawl near our mailbox, pretending to fix her scarf while her eyes darted toward my porch. I could practically hear her curiosity whispering through her teeth. But no one knew who I was marrying. No one knew Eric's last name. And no one knew that the Morgans, the family everyone in town had probably read about in Forbes, were about to become mine. It made me think about how fragile privacy really is, especially in America, where people say they mind their business but never really do. The Morgans owned a multinational company based in Boston, one that worked in renewable energy. Just last week, I'd proofread a press release at work that mentioned a $120 million contract they'd signed for new solar grids in Chicago and London. I remember blinking at that number for a full minute. It didn't feel real. Numbers like that belonged to other worlds, the kind where people didn't worry about electric bills or secondhand furniture. I work part-time in their communications department. I write copy, edit web content, sometimes press releases. I'm the one who counts commas and corrects headlines. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. Eric never wanted me to feel small next to his family's wealth. And truthfully, he never made me feel that way. But I had chosen to keep who he was a secret from everyone because I didn't want people to measure my love in dollars or stock shares. I wanted it to be my story, messy, human, real. Around 4 o'clock, just as I was about to pour more coffee, a silver car stopped in front of my house. It wasn't Eric's. My heart raced a little when I saw who stepped out. Helena Morgan. She wore simple black flats and a soft gray jacket that looked expensive only because it fit her perfectly. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly, and her expression was calm in a way that made me want to cry. She walked up the path slowly, like she already knew the whole story. "Jessica," she said when I opened the door, "we heard from Eric about this morning." I didn't know whether to apologize or fall apart, but Helena reached out and took my hands gently. "I booked the hall in Boston already," she said. "Your name is on the contract. If you want to postpone, we'll move mountains. If you want to go on, we'll move mountains anyway." Her eyes reminded me of Eric's, steady, kind, unshaken. She placed a white envelope on the kitchen table. "This isn't a favor," she said softly. "It's support. Family should help family." When she left, I opened the envelope. Inside was a note in neat handwriting. "Use this if it helps you breathe easier." Below it was a check for $25,000. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach tight. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. Not because of pride exactly, but because I needed to prove to myself, to my parents, maybe even to the air around me, that I could stand on my own feet first. Evening came, and the light turned golden. The house, for all its silence, began to feel alive again. I walked from room to room. The narrow kitchen that always smelled faintly of cinnamon, the chalk marks on the doorframe where my father had measured my height every birthday, the small workroom filled with his old tools, the teacups my mother collected lined up like moons in a perfect row. I loved them both. For all their cruelty that morning, for all the ash they left behind, I loved them. But I also loved a future that wasn't built from fear. A future that belonged to me, not to their expectations. When the sun finally dipped below the trees, I tried on the dress we had mended. The burn still showed if you looked closely, a faint shadow near the hem, stubborn and dark. I decided not to hide it. It was a part of the story now, and I would carry it into every photograph and every memory. Scars, after all, are just proof that something tried to destroy you and failed. I took my mother's letter, the one that had started all this, and slipped it into a folder marked Keep. I didn't know why I wanted to keep it, but something in me whispered that I would need it one day as a reminder of where I'd come from and what I'd survived. Before bed, I sat by the window with a notebook and rewrote my vows for the 100th time. I used easy words, words that didn't need translation, didn't hide behind fancy sentences. I choose truth. I wrote, even when it is small. I choose us, even when it is loud outside. I choose love, even when it asks me to stand alone. When I finished, I placed the notebook beside my bed and turned off the lamp. The room was dark but not empty. The house was still too quiet, still too big, but it didn't feel hollow anymore. The silence was changing. It was learning my rhythm, adjusting to a woman who had stopped waiting for permission. That night, as I drifted into sleep, I thought of Eric's voice saying, "We'll figure it out." I thought of Helena's calm eyes and Sarah's steady hands. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the ache and the fear, I began to believe that maybe I already was figuring it out, stitch by stitch, word by word, breath by breath. Morning came with noise, not the peaceful kind that begins a new day, but the kind that feels like an alarm. I woke to the hum of cars stopping and starting outside my window. At first, I thought it was nothing, delivery trucks or the neighbors' usual morning chaos. But then I heard voices, the low blend of curiosity and gossip. By the time I pulled back the curtain, 3 cars were parked along the street. I saw familiar faces stepping out, people from town who never had a reason to visit me before today. News had traveled faster than I ever imagined. Someone, somewhere, had learned who Eric really was, that he wasn't just another kind, quiet man from New York, but the son of the Morgans, the family whose business spread from Boston to London. Someone must have found out about the Morgan renewable contract worth millions, or about Helena's £50,000 donation to that museum in London that everyone in the papers praised. The story had escaped me, running wild through town like wind through loose leaves. And now, the same people who used to ignore my small house on Maple Street were staring at it like it was a museum itself. I closed the curtain, my pulse quickening. This wasn't the attention I wanted. I'd kept my life private for a reason. Love, when mixed with money, becomes a different creature entirely. Watched, judged, envied, questioned. And now my secret had become the town's favorite conversation. By noon, the sound of another car, different this time, pulled into the driveway. A yellow taxi. I didn't move at first. My hands froze around my cup of coffee. Then I saw them. My parents. They stepped out looking like 2 people who had aged years in just a few days. My father wore his old brown hat, the one he only ever took off for weddings and funerals. My mother's lips were pressed tight, her expression carved from stone. Their luggage was nowhere to be seen. They hadn't come home. They'd come to face something. When they walked up the path, I met them on the porch. I was wearing my mended dress, the one Sarah and I had worked so hard to save. I didn't plan it that way. I just hadn't taken it off after trying it on that morning. It felt like armor now, fragile but mine. My mother's eyes fell on the lace at the hem, the part still slightly darkened by fire. For a second, I thought I saw regret flicker there, but it disappeared just as quickly. My father held his hat against his chest like it hurt him to carry it. "Jessica," he began, voice rough from travel. "We didn't understand. We didn't know." He stopped mid-sentence. His gaze had shifted past me, toward the street. A sleek black car had just pulled up behind the taxi. The door opened, and out stepped Helena Morgan, graceful as always, followed by Eric, his hand holding a bouquet of white roses. The world went still. My parents' faces froze like ice. My mother's lips parted slightly, her disbelief painted clear. My father's eyes widened in slow realization. The Morgans, the name they had once spoken with a tone of distant awe, was now standing on our front walk. Helena walked forward, calm and poised, the kind of woman who didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. Eric followed her quietly, setting the roses on the porch railing as though they belonged there. There was a silence then, heavy and long, the kind that holds all the things people are too afraid to say. My mother finally spoke first, her tone trembling between pride and shame. "You should have told us," she said. "We thought," her voice cracked. "We thought he wasn't good enough for you. We thought you'd chosen beneath yourself." I almost laughed, not cruelly, but because the irony was too heavy to bear. "Beneath me?" I repeated, the words soft but sharp. "You burned my dress. You left me a letter that said I wasn't allowed to love him. You didn't even stay to ask who he was." My mother's face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the truth of it. She hadn't left out of hatred. She'd left out of fear. Not of Eric, but of losing control, of losing me. "You left me," I said again, quieter now. "You asked me to be smaller than your fear." I felt Eric's hand find mine. His palm was warm, steady. My mother's eyes fell to that gesture, and something in her melted, though she fought to hide it. Helena took a small step forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Harper," she said in her composed Boston accent, "our children are marrying because they are in love. The company is not a dowry. It's a business, sometimes a blessing, sometimes a headache." Her smile was kind but firm. My father, still holding his hat like a fragile thing, finally smiled back, faintly, almost in surrender. "Headaches I can understand," he said softly. The tension in the air broke. We all went inside, the six of us. Me, Eric, my parents, Helena, and Robert Morgan, who had arrived quietly a few minutes later. The living room, once empty and cold, filled with the smell of coffee again. I made a fresh pot, grateful for the small task to keep my hands from shaking. My father began to talk, maybe because silence felt too heavy. He told Eric about building this house for $38,000 back in the 1980s, how every board was nailed by hand, how he and my mother had painted the walls with leftover paint from the hardware store because they couldn't afford better. There was pride in his voice when he said it. I listened, realizing I'd never truly heard that story before. My mother added small details, the argument about whether to choose the blue or the beige for the kitchen, the way they'd laughed when the cat walked through the wet paint. For the first time in years, their words weren't sharp. They were soft and human again. Then Helena shared a story of her own, about her first apartment in Boston, where she and Robert had lived with nothing but 2 chairs and a mattress for almost a year while their business was just an idea. "We didn't have money then," she said with a smile. "Just faith that something would grow." I looked at Eric, and he looked at me like I was a lighthouse, something steady he could find even in fog. We didn't solve everything that day. The past doesn't vanish because you drink coffee together. But we named it, and somehow that helped. The naming of wounds is the first step toward healing them. When it was time for my parents to leave, my mother hesitated at the door. She reached into her purse and pressed a few folded bills into my palm. $200, she said. "It's not much, but..." I stopped her and gently pressed the money back into her hand. "Buy a ticket back to Italy one day," I told her. "With me. Let's go for joy next time, not escape." Her lips trembled, and for the first time since my childhood, she pulled me into her arms. "You sound just like me when I was young," she whispered. "I hope so," I said. As their taxi drove away, I stood on the porch with Eric's arm around my shoulders. The air was cool, the world finally quiet. Inside the house, the coffee cup still sat warm on the table, and for the first time in a long time, the silence felt peaceful again. Not empty, not heavy, just alive. We married in Boston on a windy Saturday. The sea outside the chapel roared like it wanted to witness every word. My mended wedding dress shimmered softly under the light. The burn mark at the hem faint but still there, a small scar that told the truth. Eric's eyes filled when I reached him. My parents sat in the front row, their faces calm at last. When the vows ended, my mother wept openly, and my father smiled the quiet smile I hadn't seen since I was a child. After the laughter, the cake, and the toasts, we drove home to New York instead of staying in Boston. We wanted to begin where everything had almost fallen apart, the small blue house on Maple Street. That night we turned on every lamp, every porch light, every flicker of brightness, until the rooms glowed warm and alive. It was our way of saying, we made it back. Life afterward was not a fairy tale, but it was honest. Mornings began with coffee and sleepy jokes. Evenings ended with Eric's head on my shoulder as we talked about bills, dreams, and how much we could save this month. We decided to put away $1,000 each month until we reached a number that felt like freedom, though freedom, we learned, is not a number at all but a feeling. Still, we kept saving. By autumn, the trees along our street turned to fire-colored gold. My parents came for dinner. My father repaired the loose porch step, saying, "A house breathes better when the lights are on." My mother brought cracked teacups from Italy and said, smiling, "They still hold tea." We never spoke of the burned dress or her letter again. Some things heal best in silence. We just sat together, eating stew, and I realized love had circled back home. Winter arrived early that year. One December evening, the power went out across the neighborhood. The dark was soft and kind. Eric lit a single candle, its flame trembling between us. Wrapped in a blanket, we sat by the window and listened to the hush outside. I told him the story about the fire, the letter, the shame, and the forgiveness that followed. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he said, "You tell it better every time." Outside, the lights flickered back to life, one by one down the street. Our house joined them, small, blue, steady. I looked around and thought, this is what love really looks like. It's not perfect, not easy, not grand. It's a house that still stands after the storm, a scar that doesn't hurt anymore, a future that hums quietly in the dark. This is America to me, not the noise, not the wealth, but the simple light that stays on. It's the warmth of someone coming home, the peace of forgiveness, the courage to start again. And when the world feels cold, I remind myself, even one candle can fill a house with light.